Hey guys, Brian here from Thumper Fab. Today I'm going to walk you through installing our welded tie rods on your Ranger 1500 or Expedition. For the first step of the OEM tie rod removal, we're going to use our 18mm socket to loosen up the flange lock nut on the underside of the knuckle. For this installation, we're going ahead and installing our forward arms as well, so that's why we've started teardown. But for just the tie rod installation, you don't need to remove the front bumper or the winch. You can move forward with just the tie rod. With the lock nut removed, you may have to hit the side of the knuckle with a rubber mallet to allow your tie rod to become unseated from the knuckle before moving on to the next step. For the next step of the tie rod replacement process, we're going to use our hammer and a long flathead screwdriver to break the clamp that seals the steering boot to the steering rack. We'll use our flathead screwdriver, and you'll want the tip of the flathead to be on the part of the clamp that's used to crimp and tighten the clamp. If you hit it there, it'll pop loose and you'll be able to remove your steering boot before moving on to your inner tie rod. With your steering boot disconnected from the steering rack, you can use some channel locks to loosen up the hose clamp that fastens the tie rod to the tie rod shaft. You want to move this out of the way, and that'll allow you to slide your steering boot down the tie rod to give us access to the inner tie rod. If you're doing the install of our Thumper Fab tie rod with your arms installed, you'll come up in the pocket of your lower control arm behind the axle to have access to your inner tie rod end. For this installation, since we're going ahead and doing the forward arms at the same time, we'll have a little bit more access. You'll want to take your largest pair of channel locks or a pipe wrench and grab the inner tie rod as firmly as you can before unthreading it from the worm gear of the steering rack. With your OEM tie rod off the vehicle, you can set it aside as the Thumper Fab tie rod will replace all components, including your steering boot. You can see here the Loctite that Polaris installs on your inner tie rod. It may make it difficult to loosen it in the beginning, which is why it's important to have a large pair of channel locks or a pipe wrench. For the next step in your tie rod installation process, you'll remove the boot that is supplied on your inner tie rod ends. You'll remove this spring clip from the body of the inner tie rod end, which will allow you to remove the boot so that it'll fit up into the steering rack. It may be kind of on there tight. Once you get it off, you can set it aside as it won't be used for installation. Then we'll move on to the next step. For the next step of the process, we'll install our Thumper Fab supplied steering boot over the long shank of our inner tie rod end. Once you have your boot fully slid down on the long shank of your inner tie rod end, you can go ahead and thread your jam nut back on. There's no need to tighten this or do anything like that until you get the toe set. And then you can do your final tightening sequence of the tie rod hardware. The one part we will fully tighten at this moment is the threads that'll fasten the inner tie rod end to the steering rack. You'll have to pull your boot back to gain access to these. And these threads you'll want to put Loctite on before securing them in the worm gear of the steering rack. Once you have this fully snugged up in the worm gear, you'll take your large channel locks and tighten it up fully. Once you have it fully threaded, you can go ahead and tighten it up with your channel locks before sliding the boot back down and onto your steering rack before clamping it down to your steering rack with a zip tie. With your steering boot fully slid onto your steering rack, you can use the provided zip ties to fasten the boot. You want to make sure and get these nice and tight so they don't back off. Once you have it tight and fully secured to the rack, you can cut off the excess using some snips. With our inner tie rod and steering boot fully fastened, the next step, we can thread our tie rod body onto the remainder of the inner tie rod. We'll thread it all the way on before moving on to the next step. Once you have your tie rod fully threaded onto the shank of your inner tie rod end, you can move on to bolting it to the knuckle. For this install, we're going to proceed with putting the arms together, and we'll come back and show you the fastening of our tie rod pin to the knuckle. For the next step in your tie rod installation, you'll remove the nut off the lower portion of the pin that'll have the tapered section. You'll install this section down through the knuckle, and this taper will seat on the tapered hole in your knuckle. Once you have the tie rod fully seated, you can go ahead and tighten up the lower, similar to the lower ball joint. You may need to hold down on the tie rod while tightening to prevent the pin from spinning inside the hole in the knuckle. Once you have your lower nut tight, you can move on and tighten up your upper nut before setting on the bike on the ground and adjusting your toe as needed for proper ride quality. With your steering pin fully tight to the knuckle and to the heim, the only thing left to do is set the vehicle on the ground, roll it back and forth a few times before setting your toe and hitting the trails.